So I'm filming for YouTube again, and this time I'm filming in my little New York gallery here, which is unusual since I now live in California. I don't get here too frequently, and I also don't film in the gallery here because whenever I arrive, there's lots of people outside there who think that I buy almost anything interesting, who like to knock on the glass and disturb me. So I hope that they do not disturb this little short film when I talk about a book. Today, I'm going to be talking about a very special book that I'm holding in my hands here, a book of hours, a medieval prayer book. Now, usually on this YouTube series, I tend to talk about, I would say, mostly inexpensive books or books that you may find, let's say, at a thrift store or a used bookshop, and I often tend to point out very interesting things that you might overlook, whether it's provenance or a book plate or some interesting aspect of the book, so that a beginning bookseller could find it and set it in its historical context and put a nice price on it and, of course, make a profit. But, of course, it is difficult to make a living as a bookseller, buying books for $50 and selling them for $100, even $500 books. So sometimes you have to go to the higher end of the spectrum. So I'm going to show you a book on the higher end of the spectrum. And now there are, of course, different levels in between those $50 books and what I'm going to show you here. But I do think it's important, if you plan on being a bookseller, to set your sights high. And of course, you have, I would say, the chicken and the egg problem. Which comes first? You get the better books first, or do you get the better clients first? And the answer is very simple. I'll solve that chicken and egg problem, at least in the context of book selling. You cannot get the better clients without taking chances first on getting the better books. So I will show you a better book. Now, this is a little bit like, I would say, years ago they had on TV that show Sex and the City. And I bring that up because of, the overlap of the Venn diagram between people who watch Sex and the City and the rare book trade, of course. And in this old episode, I recall Samantha was on. Now, I don't know why Samantha was never interested in rare book dealers, but she was interested, I think, in a model named Smith. And in the episode, I think he was going to appear on MTV, and she threw on him a pair of $600 Dior sunglasses, and he was a little bit embarrassed to wear them, but she said, "Oh no, you must wear something that the young people on MTV cannot afford, that they have to look up to, something aspirational." So this is one of those books that I understand is difficult to afford, but again, it's an aspirational book, and I want to talk to you as well where I bought it and how I go about selling an expensive book. Now, after all that gibberish, what is the book? Well, as I said, it is a book of hours, and a book of hours is a book from the Middle Ages to the early Renaissance containing various prayers, devotional prayers, and usually consists of several parts. One of the parts it begins with is often the calendar, then it goes on to the hours of the Virgin, which is usually the liturgical prayers over 8 set times throughout the day, hence you get the name A Book of Hours. Sometimes it has the penitential psalms, or usually has the penitential psalms. So if you want to contemplate your sins, that's the part you would refer to. It often has as well the office of the dead. So if you wish to comfort people in this world or make sure that people rest eternally in the next, you would read the office of the dead. When I think about a book of hours, there are also several aspects of the book I think about, at least as a book dealer. One of those aspects is what I would call the use of the book of hours. Now, when I say use, it's not in the colloquial term like I'm using this book of hours to make a profit. I mean the use in terms of the types of liturgical prayers in a book of hours are often very specific to a region or local area, that they have to follow the traditions of that local area in Europe. So you might have a book of hours according to the use of Rome, for instance, because the Roman Catholic Church was so powerful and they wanted to standardize the book of hours, so they would have various liturgical prayers according to those rites. You might have the use of Sarum, which is in Salisbury in England. So those would be the English liturgical prayers. And this particular book of hours is the use of Amiens, which is a city in northern France. Now, how does one tell, first of all, in a book of hours, it is the use of Amiens to localize it like that? Well, one of the first clues in a book like this, in a book of hours, is filled with all sorts of mysteries and clues to uncover, is in the January calendar of saints here. It says Saint Fromond, and Saint Fromond is the patron saint of Amiens. So we know right away that this is for the use of Amiens. So that localizes it to a particular area. The other things I consider when looking at a book of hours are these sometimes beautiful, grand miniatures throughout the book, and I'll show you some examples. This book contains 13 large miniatures, and interestingly, when they produced a book of hours, they didn't create it all in one place, one workshop. They often farmed out the work, and the large miniatures in this book of hours were probably actually done in Paris, where they had large workshops for the production of miniatures that went with the book. The other aspect of the book of hours that I like are the border decorations, and the very reason I bought this book of hours because it has some splendid border decorations in it. And that gives you a little insight as well, besides the prayers of the period, the economics of the medieval period, because as I said, this was produced in different areas. You know, the borders perhaps in Amiens, the large miniatures in Paris. And finally, a third aspect of the Book of Hours is that we can look at the writing, the scribe who wrote out the actual words of the prayers. And every area has its different style of writing, the orthography, we call that. And this is what we would call a Picard style. It's from the Picardy region of France. So immediately we get insight into this particular Book of Hours, where and how it was produced. Now, I said I would get back to the border illustrations in this Book of Hours, which is why I bought this book. And it is truly wonderful. It's filled, and I'll show you some examples of all sorts of medieval beasts and characters dressed up and clothing. And sometimes they're doing quite unusual things, including gambling. And of course, as a big cat person, there is a cat and a mouse. And what is wonderful about these border decorations is that they are what's called in the Burgundian style. Now, when somebody in the world of rare books or the world of art history hears of the courts of Burgundy, they're very excited. Their ears pick up because the dukes of Burgundy, and Burgundy at the time from the late 14th to the 15th century, controlled a large swath of geography, whether it was Luxembourg or northern France, Belgium, and part of the Netherlands. That was all within their realm, but they're well known as patrons of the art and had immense importance in the history of art and medieval culture. Now, in 1477, I would say, on the death of Charles the Bold in Burgundy, and I don't know if Charles the Bold died from a cold, then he wasn't so bold, I guess. No, but actually, Charles the Bold, I think, died in the Battle of Nancy, a famous battle where they tried to expand the Burgundian Empire, which then failed and was divided between the Habsburgs and France. But this book was probably produced slightly after 1477 in Amiens, when it was returned to the French. But even though it had been returned to the French, it still keeps the echoes and the memory of that wonderful, rich Burgundian culture, which is really shown in all of the characters in the border decorations, which we will explore, as I said, monsters and snails and all sorts of curious characters and dresses. So that is the main reason I was interested, because border decorations like this, certainly they're not absolutely unusual in books of hours, but for a book like this with so many, it really struck my imagination and gives a lot to explore. Now, another aspect of this particular book of hours that I loved is the juxtaposition of the borders and the solemn prayers inside. Now, from a modern perspective, you don't necessarily combine the holy, the sacred with the profane, or the sacred with the secular. It seems weird to be making a prayer or saying a prayer to the Blessed Virgin and then seeing a picture, let's say, of a monkey on a toilet right next to it. It just doesn't work necessarily from modern eyes. But from the medieval period, this was absolutely normal. It was normal for a few reasons. First of all of these characters may have had some sort of medieval symbolism, some of which we understand, but some of which also has been lost to time. Besides that, they might have given moral lessons that we might only partially grasp today. But there's also this wonderful juxtaposition of these very odd, unusual border designs around these sacred prayers, as if you are told to look at the outside world and all of the chaos in the outside world and all of the sinful behavior, and to separate that from the inside, which is the holy prayer that you're reciting. So a lot of that appealed to me, as I said, as a wonderful example of a combination of the sacred and the profane in a book of hours. And it's just so splendidly illustrated with these wonderful colors. Now, it begs the question, first of all, where did I get a book like this? And how do I go about selling an expensive book like this? Because as I said, this is not a YouTube course on the medieval period. This is a YouTube course on book selling. And I can tell you right off the bat, this was not an inexpensive purchase. This came from Christie's in 2022, and it cost £130,000 at auction. So you're talking the exact equivalents in dollars today, but something about $180,000. And if you want to go selling a manuscript, of course, you can't ask a huge profit margin, especially something that has been recently sold at auction. But you can add something to it, especially if you draw and bring out the wonderful facets of the manuscript that you found so fascinating and which were the reasons that you purchased it. But where do you go about selling then a $250,000 manuscript to try and even make a profit on something like this? Well, when I start thinking about the clients for a really expensive book of hours, there's both institutional, I would say, and private clients for something like that. Now, institutions can be probably broken down into a couple of categories. First of all, there's institutions that already possess books of hours that might have some similarity to this particular book of hours. And hello, Bodleian, if you're interested. They might have a book of hours from Amiens and they want to compare the scribe, or they might find certain badges or secrets in this book of hours, which really can be elucidated or studied if you have a sister text next to it in the very same library. So those type of libraries may indeed be interested in this particular book of hours. Another library that could be interested in a book of hours is one that doesn't possess any medieval manuscripts, but wants a wonderful example of a book of hours for their faculty or their students to attract them. And this would be a superb addition to a relatively new library like that. And you can imagine having a course in history and going to the library and examining, with the students, a wonderful book like this. Then, of course, there's private collectors who do indeed buy very expensive books, certainly well-off private collectors to afford a book on this level. And I would say they buy it with two aspects in mind. One, of course, you have to love something erudite and interesting like this, but there's also a financial aspect. You want to be able to invest in an important book, and you hope that over time it's going to go up in value as a financial asset sort of would. But when you weigh against some of the things that they're buying today in the collectible world, whether it's like a 1952 Mickey Mantle card, which might get $20-30 million today, you can see the value in a book of hours, with I think 13 miniatures done in the 15th century, and suddenly there's an inherent value to the $250,000, certainly when compared to these baseball cards. So it's a question of whether you want a 52 Mantle or a 77 Burgundian, even if that's 1477. And of course, there are wealthy people who take into consideration taxes. And I don't really deal with all the tax shenanigans in the IRS code, but there are people who purchase things for donations for university libraries for those purposes, of course. Now, when I go about selling this, first of all, I catalog it for a major fair. The next fair that we're doing, I think, is in Boston at the ABAA show there. And it appears in the catalog. And once it's cataloged, and again, I discuss all of the various interesting aspects I've talked about in this video and try and market it, then I will start to contact those very universities that I think this book might appeal to and display it at the fair. And hopefully I get an interest from a curator or a private client for something like this. But you can see at that level, it ties up a lot of capital and it can be a risky business. But as I said, in between the $50, $100 books and the books that are $250,000 are certainly a lot of levels, whether you put your money into a $5,000 or $10,000 book to take a chance, to try and hook a really interesting private client. It's certainly worth it to build up the quality of your inventory and expertise over time. So I hope you've enjoyed this little video on my little book of hours here, and make sure you subscribe for some more book selling tips in the future.